Good afternoon, MMA fans. It's your boy Finn, the host of Fighting with Finn, the MMA podcast where we discuss all things mixed martial arts, combat sports, and sprinkle in some other topics from time to time as well. Today, we're coming to you with a post-fight recap of UFC Fight Night 163 at CSKA Arena, Moscow. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Upcoming Fight Night 164, and then discuss some current events as well. So a pretty exciting fight card this past weekend. I mean, the co-main and the main event were really the only, notable fights that, for the casuals at least. The hardcores obviously recognize some names on the undercard and prelims and things like that. First thing I wanted to kind of highlight was the welterweight showdown between Abu Bakar Nurmagomedov and David Zawada. Obviously, this is notable because this is Khabib's cousin. Khabib was there in his corner, one of his cornermen, and then obviously Khabib's father, too, was there to support. Fight was interesting, to say the least. It was a first-round submission, less than 3 minutes in. Interesting to see, a grappler that comes from the Nurmagomedov clan get submitted, but unfortunately he was. Submitted 2 minutes and 50 seconds into the first round via rear naked choke. Actually, let's see. I believe it was. I think it was. Yeah, actually. So he was submitted rear naked choke in the first. So definitely not the best showing for Khabib and his teammates, but unfortunately it happens in the fight business. The other two real notable fights, I do want to give honorable mention to Danny Roberts. Huge, knockout finish there. He got the KO at the end of the second round. We'll note here it was 4 minutes and 54 seconds into the second round. So ultimately pretty back and forth. And then Imadeev basically baited him into a firefight. Then at the end, he zigged when he should have zagged and got knocked out. So it was a beautiful showing for Danny Hot Chocolate Roberts. The co-main event was a showdown between Alexander Volkov and Greg Hardy. I think a lot of people wanted Greg Hardy to lose this fight, but found that it would be somewhat interesting because he's stepping up, the level of competition that he's facing, and someone like an Alexander Volkov. So the fight wasn't super compelling. I mean, Greg was out there. I mean, he went the distance, obviously, with a very, very good fighter. So that says a lot for his career and his longevity. He looked to be a little more composed as he has, in some of his fights dating back to the Contender Series. He would come out with his hands down, load up on every single punch, and just looking to be more of a polished, kind of well-rounded fighter. So American Top Team has definitely worked wonders for him and with him. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough in this fight for him to find victory, but Volkov was able to successfully kind of maintain his distance, picked him apart from the outside. There was a little bit of drama, so to speak, within this fight. Greg, I guess, injured his right hand at some point. And that is, effectively his biggest weapon that he has. So it's unfortunate to see that there. It got to a point where even commentary staff like Paul Felder and Dan Hardy were making a point to say and point out, the lack of him actually throwing that hand and using it. So congratulations to Volkov. He got obviously a unanimous decision in that fight. Was good for Greg's career because it showed that he could be in there with someone tough like Volkov, like a seasoned veteran, and could hold his ground. Unfortunately, wasn't enough for him this night, so that moves his record to 5-2 with 1 no contest. The main event on this card, super, super interesting. I think most fight fans were probably tuning in for this and this alone. Zabit Magomed Sharipov versus Calvin Kattar. I thought the fight was going to be a little bit closer than what it was. I mean, in all reality, it was a pretty close fight. I gave rounds 1 and 2 to Zabit, and then the last round to Calvin. It seemed as if Zabit kind of gassed towards the end of the third, but I mean, ultimately, super creative striker. Was out there electrifying. I mean, his movement, his hand speed, and his ability to slip all the big punches that Calvin were throwing was incredible. Calvin definitely came back at the end of round 3 and was showing his polished boxing skills here, but ultimately I don't believe it was enough really to sway the judges, and clearly it wasn't because Zabit took the victory there. I, had been telling some of my friends and peers and things like that this had the potential to be fight of the year. was a little lackluster. Definitely wasn't, up there with the Kelvin and Israel Adesanya fight. Wasn't close to it, so I don't think it dethrones that fight by any means. Wasn't a bad fight though. I mean, Zabit definitely showed off his striking skills. He's still just the creative, rambunctious striker that we all know that he is. Respect to Calvin. I mean, he did a good job in this fight. Proved that he deserves to be in there with someone like Zabit, a very decorated striker and super creative guy. But ultimately didn't have enough to be able to take that victory that night. So congratulations to Zabit. Let's see the next upcoming, and needless to say, I'm not sure what's going to happen in the featherweight division. I don't know if that's enough to see, the winner of Volkanovski and Holloway, if Zabit will get the next title shot after that, depending on who wins. I mean, he's definitely at a point where I think he could rally for that title shot and maybe make that call. Ultimately, I don't know if the UFC is going to give that to him. I would absolutely love to see a Yair Rodriguez versus Zabit Magomedsharipov. I think that has the makings of one of the greatest fights of all time, potentially. Styles make fights, obviously, as everyone knows, and I think that would be a very interesting fight between those two. So selfishly, I'd like to see that fight happen. Don't know that it does before Zabit gets a title shot, and even if maybe he doesn't get the title shot next, we'll see what happens. But that would definitely be an awesome either number one contender fight or just classic fight just for the fans. Moving on a little bit, our upcoming UFC Fight Night 164 is headlined by Jan Blachowicz and Jacare Souza. The co-main event is a light heavyweight bout between Mauricio Shogun Rua and Paul Craig. Charles Oliveira is on this card as well. Aside from that, some up-and-comers and things, but for the most part, the co-main and the main event are really what's going to have people tuning in here. Very interesting fights here. I'm not going to make any pre-fight picks. Not really sure which direction to go. I mean, I think a lot of people would think that this light heavyweight fight is going to be pretty close, and I think that it most likely will too. Jan's coming off of that knockout, and then Jacare's coming off of the decision loss to Jack Hermanson. Had he won that fight, he most likely would have been next up for the title shot, but before that had a big win over Chris Weidman. Got the knockout on him, and then before that had lost to Kelvin Gastelum. So he's definitely in there with some of the best guys. I mean, as you can see from his record, he lost to Jack Hermanson last, beat Chris Weidman before Weidman moved up to light heavyweight, lost to Kelvin Gastelum there, who fought in the interim title fight, so a number one contender, one of those gatekeepers to get to the title, beat a Derek Brunson, and then lost to the previous champion prior to Adesanya, Robert Whittaker. So he's been in there with some of the best guys in the world. His jiu-jitsu and jits game is incredible. He definitely has knockout power, as we've seen. I mean, he knocked out Derek Brunson with a head kick, knocked out Chris Weidman via punches. But then you've got a guy like Jan, who is coming off some big wins as well. He knocked out Luke Rockhold previously, lost to Thiago Santos before that, but Santos, as we'd seen, is a very tough customer. Just got finished fighting John Jones for the title contention there. Almost beat Jones. Some actually said that they think he did beat John Jones. I'm not with that. I think John's the greatest fighter of all time, and he played a very safe game plan to win that fight. But interestingly enough, everyone knows, the knee injury with Santos, so his ability to stay in there with someone like John, the youngest UFC champion of all time, probably one of the greatest fighters we've ever seen in the octagon. So this will certainly be a very, very interesting fight. That's made up for the main event there, UFC 164, this weekend, Saturday, November the 16th. And then Mauricio Shogun Rua, it's always great to see him fight. Definitely a very seasoned veteran, had a few fights under his belt. We'll see what happens come Saturday when he fights, someone definitely less experienced than himself. I mean, you're looking at Shogun's record. He's got 37 fights professionally versus, this guy who's got around, definitely under half. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Some current events and things that I wanted to kind of just touch on briefly. Things that have been in the media, catching up on some events that happened last weekend as well. big thing coming off of his win against Kelvin Gastelum. Darren Till was very transparent about his experiences leading up to that UFC fight night. Kind of controversially saying that he felt like he wanted to fake an injury, had some anxiety about fighting, ultimately went out there and won a big decision over Kelvin Gastelum, his first fight in the middleweight division. He, interestingly enough, in that same post-fight interview, was saying that he was afraid of Yoel Romero, or not necessarily afraid of him, but called him a beast, and said, anyone that wants to fight that guy is kind of off their rocker. And then afterwards proceeded to, I guess, call out Yoel Romero, which was kind of an interesting play. To then, as of this morning, it looks like he's been calling out Robert Whittaker, had been tweeting at him, trying to get some kind of bite from the previous champion, trying to campaign for that fight. So in true Darren Till fashion, we see him out here, not backing down for any man, pursuing certainly the hardest fights that he can for his career. Sometimes pays off, sometimes it doesn't. Strung together a couple losses, lost the title shot to Tyron Woodley, then got knocked out by Jorge Masvidal, then most recently, a couple weeks back, beating Kelvin Gastelum, who is most likely the number one contender for that division still at middleweight, in his middleweight debut, and then now is calling out the previous middleweight champion in Robert Whittaker. So definitely not taking the easy route there. No easy fights for Darren Till. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with him. I found it interesting that he wanted to take kind of the slow and steady route now that he's kind of revitalized himself and had made his debut at middleweight, to calling out Yoel Romero, who's terrifying, one of the most terrifying guys in that division, and then going directly after the most recent champion who was just dethroned by Israel Adesanya. So tough go for that guy. Super, super tough career for him. Next item I just wanted to touch on briefly. Carlos Condit is out for an undisclosed injury. It will be interesting to see what happens with that. I know probably some people were going to speculate that it was USADA issues. I'm not sure that I would go that far as to say that it had anything to do with that. Any foul play. Definitely getting up there in age. Definitely a little bit older, kind of a veteran to the sport. So could have been, some kind of really and truly injury from training. So best to his team. Hopefully he recovers quickly. It'd be awesome to see him in there again. Another thing I wanted to touch on after the UFC fight at MSG for the BMF title, it seemed that we got Nick Diaz to come back out of the shadows, or Nate got Nick to come back out of the shadows, rather. So first time coming back to the spotlight in the UFC, basically agreed to do an interview with Ariel Helwani. I'm sure most of you listened to it, or at least seen some kind of coverage from other MMA media about it. It was a tough listen for a number of reasons. I could see throughout the duration of the interview evidence of some tough damage and some things that he's taken over the years in the duration of his career. I guess people were speculating that he wasn't sober, and that certainly could be a part of it. But I found him through durations of the interview to be absolutely brilliant and putting together some great thoughts, some very well articulated thoughts. But then there were also some moments where there were some unrecognizable words and some thoughts that he couldn't even string together in an entire idea. It just seemed like he was struggling a lot. And then kind of looking through media this week too, I'd seen some highlights of him training. I think the one that comes to mind most clearly was one that had come out about him hitting a speed bag. And I mean, it certainly looked like his hand speed was still there. He still certainly seemed sharp. I just worry for the longevity of his life if he hasn't potentially taken too much damage. I wouldn't say Nick and Nate, either of those guys, either of the brothers, are the most well outspoken or certainly do the best in interviews, but having not seen him in a while, definitely in media and too long to remember, it was a little bit tough to listen. He seemed very jaded. He seemed, and I mean, understandably so, he was the recipient of a ridiculous judgment by both UFC and USADA, and then obviously had been vindicated, so to speak. But it seemed like through parts of the interview he was calling for a fight and was interested in coming back and fighting potentially. He made it seem that he didn't need the fight game, and he certainly doesn't. I mean, he runs successful jiu-jitsu gyms and said that he was expanding, so good for him. I think everyone would love to see Nick Diaz back in the UFC and would be interested to see who he fights next. Do I want to see him fight a Jorge Masvidal? Selfishly, I do. I think that would be a great fight. It could either be a great fight or an absolute travesty for him. It could be more than he, biting off more than he can chew, so to speak, coming back and fighting someone like a Masvidal. And that's not to say that I think that fight could even happen. Obviously, Masvidal's star power is bigger than it ever has been, probably ever will be, depending on what happens in his career from here on out. And with Nate's kind of rocky relationship that he's had with the UFC and just being kind of jaded, who knows? I mean, I know those guys always stay in good shape, so I don't think conditioning is an issue. I wouldn't think, it would take him long to jump back on the horse, so to speak, if he got back into the swing of training, or think that he may have continued to been training this entire time. So that's not the problem. I just think, his rocky past and relationship with the UFC, that in conjunction with the star power of someone like a Jorge Masvidal right now probably wouldn't allow for that fight to get done. With that said, if Nick came back and won a fight or two, I think he could do the same thing that Nate did. I think he could come back and fight someone like an Anthony Pettis that has some name recognition and has kind of a larger star power and is very recognizable with the casual type fan, and get a big win or two, and then be right back up there and have the ability to call out someone like a Jorge Masvidal for, not necessarily a BMF type fight or anything with that much fanfare. But his name definitely carries power, and everyone knows the Diaz brothers are some of the biggest stars in the UFC today. So whichever direction he chooses to go, I certainly hope he takes a safe one. Like I said, I didn't think that interview wasn't an easy listen. Was not an easy listen. Next item I wanted to talk about, Ariel Helwani had a literally star-studded, action-packed show from this previous week. The same show that he did the comeback interview with Nick Diaz. He had a lot of UFC current champions, previous champions, things like that. One of which was Stipe Miocic. He had Stipe on and they discussed a lot of different things. But one thing that I thought was interesting was when it came to the Cormier fight and the trilogy fight. Stipe made it seem as if he wasn't interested in that fight. I don't know if that's a tactic to get into DC's head or try and push back on DC, similar to the way that DC did to him in between their first and second fight, where he took the Derek Lewis fight in between that and then said that he was going to keep Stipe on the sidelines to try and get the Brock Lesnar fight, the big money fight, so to speak. So I don't know if that's a tactic by Stipe to, like I said, proverbially get into DC's head or not. Interesting one if that's kind of his angle. Stipe also kind of went into a little bit of detail and talked about Ariel prodded him. He wasn't coming out to say anything about it, but Ariel prodded him and wanted him to discuss a surgery that he had. Apparently had some damage done to one of his eyes that he had done, after the fight. And then that kind of prompted into the discussion of eye pokes and talking about from the first fight how he'd been poked a couple times, several times by DC. And then in the follow-up, the following fight, rather, DC Stipe 2, when he won his title back, he was poked in the eye as well. So I thought it was interesting because you didn't hear much from Stipe. You heard it from all fans and media coverage that was a factor in the initial fight and probably would be a factor in the second fight. But I think speaks pretty highly of his character that he's not one to go out and bash another guy for something that potentially could be an accident. 2 fights in a row, it makes it a little more difficult to think that may not have been entirely accidental. I mean, I know DC's obviously an incredible competitor, a very professional and a very technical guy. Could just be accidental eye pokes. Who knows? But it definitely played a significant factor in the fight. So again, not sure if that is a tactic by Stipe or if he truly doesn't care to have that fight again with DC now that he took his title, reclaimed his title back decisively, fought hard, literally had to dig deep to win that title back from the guy that took it from him, or if it's he's truly just not interested. So we'll see what happens with that. He also jokingly kind of called out Tyson Fury, who leaked a video of him training with Darren Till, showing some of his MMA skills, and was basically just kind of kneeing the pads and throwing some elbows in the pads in an octagon. at the direction kind of being coached by Darren Till. So we'll see what happens with that. Stipe said he would box him or fight him in MMA. I don't know if this is the Conor McGregor May Mac call out, or if like Jorge tried to call out Canelo. These guys just want to get boxing money. I'm sure that probably plays a pretty significant portion or part into it. But let's just try to, I'm a proponent of let's just keep it in the octagon. Two separate sports. If Tyson Fury wants to come and do MMA, that's fine. But I don't want to see any more MMA guys get in there with boxing guys. It's really not my cup of tea. Wanted to finish off and just kind of close, talk about the kind of miss of the week, so to speak, was the Logan Paul versus KSI. Pretty comical display. I mean, there was a lot of celebrities in the midst. I mean, Adesanya himself showed up and I guess was at the fight. So a lot of fanfare, things like that. Something I wanted to mention with that too was the whole Dylan Dennis, Logan Paul debacle, where Logan and Dylan have been fighting back and forth, kind of picking at one another on social media. Logan Paul, it depends on which day you talk to him. Some days he says that he'll fight Dylan Dennis in MMA. After his loss to KSI, he's now saying that he thinks Dylan Dennis's jiu-jitsu, and justifyingly so, is probably too much for him in an MMA form of fight. So thought it was interesting that after having talked all that smack back and forth, and Logan Paul feeling like a big guy through social media, felt the need that Dylan Dennis and the organization should ban him. So I thought that was pretty comical. I mean, a huge win for Dylan. Obviously, he's going to be able to ride high off of that for the rest of his life, knowing he basically punked out Logan Paul. So that was awesome. Whether you're a Dylan Dennis fan or not, I think it's hilarious that a YouTuber would think they can step in there with a professional fighter, a world-renowned jiu-jitsu practitioner, and an undefeated MMA fighter at that, and find some success. It is hilarious to see him backstep and realize what he's really in for. Bare Knuckle has some big fights coming up. I can't remember if it's this weekend or next. I guess we can look it up. It looks like, so yeah, I guess it is this weekend. So BKFC has Artem Lobov versus Jason Knight 2. If you remember the initial fight, this was incredible. I mean, they looked absolutely grotesque, Frankenstein-esque by the end. That fight was incredible. So I'm looking forward to it. I don't think it's something that the vast majority of people that enjoy combat sports necessarily get behind, but I think it's interesting, and it's great to see guys that are pretty technical on their feet do this. Unfortunately, I don't like the damage that it comes from it. I mean, it's effectively a lifetime worth of cuts that they're sustaining in one night, but certainly something fun and something cool for the fans. That pretty much concludes everything that I had tonight. What I will do is we'll do a fight recap next week for the UFC events this weekend, and kind of highlight the upcoming events, as well as talk about some current events and things like that. Like I said before, if there's any questions or anything else you'd like us to discuss, please feel free to reach out to me directly on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, whatever it may be. On social media, our Twitter is Fighting with Finn. On Twitch, you can find us as Fighting with Finn. We will be streaming live on Twitch every week, each recording, and then also I'll upload them to YouTube afterwards. Our YouTube is Fighting with Finn. So we do appreciate those of you that listen, watch, wherever you may be in the world. Subscribe, comment, like, share with your friends, and let us know what we can do better. And would certainly be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Upcoming in the future, we hope to do things like interviews, live coverage of events, and then go out there in the world and interview random people about MMA as well. So be on the lookout for those. Again, appreciate everyone that's paying attention. Thanks.